Pastor Trocmé was a very distant person. He was a leader. To his wife, he was completely different. So he was both warm and distant. It was very strange. They did not treat me like a refugee child. They treated me more like a French youngster.
It was 1940. The world was falling apart. War raged across Europe, spreading fear and chaos like wildfire. France had fallen under the crushing boot of Nazi occupation, and with it, hope seemed to flicker and fade. But in a small, unassuming village nestled in the mountains of Chambon-sur-Lignon, a different kind of resistance was brewing. One fueled not by guns or bullets, but by the quiet, unyielding courage of a woman named Magda Trocmé. Magda was no soldier. She wasn't trained in combat or espionage. She was simply a pastor's wife, a mother, a woman who understood the power of compassion. But sometimes, it is the smallest acts of kindness that carry the greatest weight. Magda's story begins not with grand speeches or dramatic confrontations, but with an open door, a door that she refused to close, even as danger loomed. The village of Le Chambon was a unique place, known for its deep Protestant roots and its tradition of offering refuge to those in need. But when the war began, the stakes were higher than ever. Jewish families, hunted by the Nazis and their collaborators, fled for their lives. They arrived in Le Chambon, desperate, terrified, with nowhere else to turn, and Magda, with her quiet strength, was there to welcome them. The first knock came late one night. A Jewish woman, her face etched with exhaustion and fear, stood on the threshold of the Trocmé home. She had nowhere else to go. Magda looked into her eyes and knew she couldn't turn her away. "Come in," she said softly. It was a simple invitation, but it carried with it a world of risk. The Nazis were known for their brutality, and anyone caught helping Jews faced imprisonment or death. But Magda didn't hesitate. She had always believed in the power of doing what was right, no matter the cost. Together with her husband, Pastor André Trocmé, Magda began to organize a network of shelter and protection. They knew the dangers. They had seen the Gestapo's relentless pursuit of anyone who defied the Reich. But Magda was determined. She couldn't stand by while innocent lives were destroyed. Le Chambon became a haven, a place where Jews could find safety and rest, if only for a little while. But this sanctuary wasn't built on secrecy or silence. No, Magda's defiance was loud, clear, and unapologetic. She refused to hide behind closed doors. Instead, she opened them wider, welcoming the oppressed with open arms, no matter the consequences. It was more than just shelter Magda offered. She provided hope in a time when hope was scarce. For many of the Jewish families who passed through Le Chambon, Magda was a beacon of light in their darkest hour. Her kindness, her unwavering commitment to justice, gave them the strength to carry on. And yet, despite the overwhelming danger, Magda never sought recognition for her actions. She was driven by something far deeper, a sense of duty, of compassion, of humanity. But how long could this fragile resistance last? How long before the Nazis, with their spies and informers, caught wind of what was happening in this quiet village? Magda knew the risks all too well. The Gestapo's reach was vast, their punishments swift and brutal. Every day she lived with the knowledge that a single misstep could mean disaster, not just for her family, but for the entire village. Yet still she persisted. Magda believed that the world needed more than just words. It needed action. It needed people willing to take risks for the sake of others. And that belief, that fierce conviction, was what kept her going, even as the storm of war raged all around. The tension was palpable. Every time a new family arrived, the stakes grew higher. The villagers were terrified, but they were also inspired. Magda's courage was infectious, and soon, others in Le Chambon began to follow her example. Homes were opened, food was shared, and a network of quiet defiance took shape. Together, they formed a community of resistance, bound not by violence, but by a shared commitment to humanity. But how long could they keep this up? How long before the Nazi regime, with all its cruelty and efficiency, came knocking at their doors? Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The quiet defiance of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon grew stronger with each passing day. Yet for every life Magda and the villagers saved, the danger increased. They were sheltering not just a few families, but hundreds of Jewish men, women, and children. They were hiding them in barns, attics, and even out in the forests, each one of them a human being whose life hung by a fragile thread. It wasn't long before the Gestapo began to suspect that something was amiss in this remote village. Whispers spread, and the Nazi forces, always vigilant, began their search. The pressure intensified. French collaborators roamed the countryside, eager to earn favor by informing on anyone harboring Jews. It seemed inevitable that someone would betray them. But Magda Trocmé was undeterred. She had always understood that fear was the enemy, fear of the Nazis, fear of retribution, fear of what could happen to her own family, and yet she refused to let that fear dictate her actions. "We have no right to do otherwise," she would say, over and over to anyone who hesitated in offering help. And it wasn't just empty words. There was something about the way Magda carried herself, the way she faced each day with unwavering resolve that inspired those around her. Even in the face of certain death, Magda remained steady. She had an incredible ability to connect with people, to see their fear and gently push them beyond it. She knew what was at stake, and she wasn't afraid to remind others that the choice between life and death wasn't just theoretical, it was right in front of them. One particularly harrowing night, the Gestapo arrived in the village. Word had spread that they were coming, but there was little time to act. Jewish families, children still half asleep, were rushed into hiding places, beneath floorboards, behind false walls, deep into the woods. Magda's heart raced, but she remained outwardly calm. She knew that panic would only lead to disaster. The Nazis knocked on doors, demanding to search homes. They interrogated villagers, seeking anyone who might have seen or heard something suspicious. Magda stood firm as they arrived at her door. With her steely resolve, she met the eyes of the officer leading the raid. "We have heard there are Jews hiding in this village," the officer growled, his gaze cold and unflinching. Magda didn't flinch either. "We have nothing to hide," she said simply, her voice calm but resolute. It wasn't a lie, not in the way the Gestapo would understand. Magda wasn't hiding something. She was protecting lives. The officer's eyes scanned the room, looking for signs of deception. But Magda held her ground, unwavering, and after what felt like an eternity, the officer signaled for his men to move on. That night, no one was taken. It was a small victory, but it meant everything to those who had been saved. But this close call served as a chilling reminder. They were living on borrowed time. Magda knew that the Gestapo would be back. She knew the Nazis would not rest until they had rooted out every last Jewish refugee in the village. And yet, despite the growing threat, she continued to open her door to those in need. Every act of kindness, every life saved, was a quiet rebellion against the forces of hate and cruelty. What gave Magda such strength? How did she continue to find the courage to resist, even as the danger mounted with each passing day? It was love, a fierce, unshakable love for humanity. Magda believed deeply and passionately in the sanctity of life. She couldn't stand by while innocents were hunted, persecuted, and murdered. And it wasn't just about saving lives. It was about preserving dignity, about offering a glimmer of hope in a world consumed by darkness. One of the families Magda helped was a young Jewish couple, Esther and David, along with their 2 children. They had been on the run for weeks, barely escaping capture multiple times. By the time they reached Le Chambon, they were gaunt, exhausted, and broken. The children, no older than 6, clung to their parents, their eyes wide with fear. They hadn't spoken in days. Magda took them in without hesitation. She offered them food, shelter, and a chance to rest. But more than that, she offered them something they hadn't felt in a long time: safety. For the first time in weeks, Esther and David could breathe, knowing that for now at least they were safe. But safety was never guaranteed. They knew that. Magda knew that. And yet, for those precious few days in Le Chambon, they were able to sleep without fear. It wasn't much, but it was everything to a family who had seen the worst of humanity. As the days passed, more and more refugees arrived, and Magda's resolve only deepened. Each new face, each new story of survival and loss, reminded her of the importance of what they were doing. The world might be on fire, but here, in this small corner of France, they were building something different, something hopeful. As 1941 approached, the village of Le Chambon had become a lifeline for hundreds of Jewish refugees, but the weight of this responsibility pressed harder on Magda Trocmé and the villagers. It wasn't just the ever-present fear of discovery by the Gestapo, it was also the daily reality of survival. Resources were stretched thin, food was scarce, and winter was harsh in the mountains. But even in the face of these overwhelming challenges, Magda found ways to persevere. One cold evening, a frail older woman arrived at Magda's door, trembling from the chill and from fear. Her name was Sarah, and she had lost everything: her family, her home, her sense of safety. She had walked for days, barely escaping a raid that had torn her family apart. With her voice shaking, she pleaded for shelter, knowing that Magda's kindness could be her last hope. Magda didn't hesitate. She welcomed Sarah inside, offering her warmth, food, and a place to rest. "You are safe here," Magda whispered, gently taking Sarah's hand. "We will protect you." This simple act of compassion was repeated time and again. Each knock on the door was a new story of survival and heartbreak, but Magda never wavered. She had long ago accepted that helping these people wasn't just an act of resistance, it was her moral duty. She could not turn away, not when so much was at stake. And yet, the pressure continued to mount. Rumors began to spread throughout the region. The Nazis were tightening their grip, and informers, motivated by fear or the promise of reward, were everywhere. Still, Le Chambon held firm, with Magda at the heart of this quiet resistance. She knew that their defiance couldn't last forever, but she also knew that every day they managed to keep these families safe was a victory. And yet, danger came ever closer. One morning, just before dawn, Pastor André Trocmé was summoned to appear before the authorities in the nearby town of Vichy. The Nazis had grown suspicious of the village's unusual activity, and they wanted answers. Word of this meeting reached Magda, and her heart sank. She knew what such a summons could mean. The Gestapo didn't ask questions, they demanded obedience. Any sign of defiance could lead to immediate arrest, or worse. As her husband prepared to leave, Magda could see the worry in his eyes. "Do not fear," she whispered, though her own fear was palpable. "We have done what is right. Whatever happens, we cannot regret that." The meeting was tense. The Nazi officers interrogated André Trocmé, asking about the village's activities and whether they were harboring Jews. With remarkable composure, André refused to give them what they wanted. He did not lie, but he did not betray the refugees either. "We do not know Jews here," he said, his words deliberate and measured. "We know only human beings." Back in Le Chambon, Magda waited anxiously for her husband's return. The hours dragged by, each moment filled with uncertainty. But when he finally came back, there was relief, at least for now. The authorities hadn't arrested him, but they had made their warning clear. The village was being watched, and any further resistance would not be tolerated. Magda knew what this meant. The noose was tightening. The Gestapo would come again, and next time they might not be so lenient. But even in the face of this growing danger, Magda remained resolute. She continued to organize safe houses, to arrange for false papers, and to find ways to move refugees out of France, deeper into neutral Switzerland. It was a delicate dance. One misstep, and it could all come crashing down. One day, a family arrived at Magda's doorstep. They were exhausted, with their young daughter barely able to walk. They had narrowly escaped deportation and had made their way to Le Chambon in a state of utter desperation. Magda saw the fear in their eyes, but she also saw something else. Hope. Hope that they had found a place where they could be safe, where they could live without fear, if only for a little while. But safety, as Magda knew all too well, was never guaranteed. The family was hidden in a nearby farmhouse, but even as they rested, Magda couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that their time was running out. The Nazis were growing more aggressive, more determined to root out resistance. And then, it happened. The Gestapo arrived in force. They swept through the village like a storm, demanding to know where the Jews were hiding. Soldiers marched through the streets, banging on doors, dragging people into the town square for questioning. The fear was palpable, but Magda remained calm. She had prepared for this moment, though no amount of preparation could truly ease the terror of watching her village become a target of Nazi brutality. Magda knew that the villagers wouldn't betray her. They couldn't. But would their courage hold under the threat of violence? The soldiers eventually made their way to Magda's home. Once again, she stood at her door, facing down the terror that had come to claim her village. The lead officer, with a cold, calculating gaze, demanded answers. "Where are they?" he barked, his voice echoing through the quiet streets. Magda looked him straight in the eye, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice steady. "We will not give you what you seek," she replied calmly. Her words hung in the air, defiant yet controlled. She knew that what she was doing was dangerous, perhaps even fatal, but she couldn't give in to fear. Not now. The soldiers searched her home, turning over furniture, tearing through the rooms, but they found nothing. And as they moved on, Magda stood tall, knowing that while the danger had not passed, her defiance had given her village one more day of hope. The tension in Chambon-sur-Lignon only continued to grow as the war raged on. Each new arrival at Magda Trocmé's door brought with it another layer of risk, another life that needed protection. But it was also a reminder of why she and her fellow villagers had chosen this path of resistance, despite the constant threat of death hanging over them. They had become a beacon of hope in a time when hope was hard to come by. But the villagers, like Magda, were beginning to tire. The relentless strain of hiding hundreds of Jews, of constantly looking over their shoulders, was wearing on them. And yet, Magda's resolve never wavered. She knew that the Gestapo would come again, and when they did, they wouldn't be satisfied with just a search. They would want answers, names, and retribution. It was in the summer of 1942 when the most brutal wave of Nazi roundups began. France had fallen deeper under the control of the Vichy government, and Jewish deportations to concentration camps were increasing at an alarming rate. The Nazis were growing desperate to eliminate any resistance, and the quiet village of Le Chambon was on their radar. Magda could sense that their time was running out, but it was precisely at this moment, when fear should have paralyzed the village, that Magda did something extraordinary. She opened her doors even wider. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the rolling hills, a group of Jewish children arrived at the Trocmé home, exhausted from their long journey. They had been smuggled out of a nearby internment camp, where they had been separated from their parents, and they were terrified. Their faces, hollowed by hunger and fear, told stories too tragic for words. And yet, when Magda saw them, she didn't hesitate. She took them in, offering what little food and comfort she could. The children, still shaking from their ordeal, slowly began to trust the woman who had opened her home to them. For the first time in what felt like forever, they could sleep without fear. As Magda tucked them into makeshift beds that night, she couldn't help but feel a deep sadness. These were children, innocent, helpless, caught in a war they didn't understand. She knew that she couldn't save them all, but for these few at least, she could offer a sanctuary. A small oasis of safety in a world gone mad, but safety was always fleeting. Days later, word came that the Gestapo was planning a major raid on the village. They had heard rumors of children being hidden, and they were determined to root them out. Panic spread through Le Chambon. The villagers knew that this raid could mean the end of their efforts. If the Gestapo found the children, not only would their lives be at risk, but the entire network of resistance could be exposed. Magda, however, remained calm. She knew the time had come to act. There was no running, no hiding this time. The village had to make a choice. Would they give in to fear, or would they stand firm in their belief that every life, no matter how small or helpless, was worth saving? And so, with remarkable courage, the villagers did something extraordinary. They gathered together, preparing to face the Nazi threat head-on. They weren't armed with guns or weapons of war. Instead, they were armed with their shared conviction, an unbreakable belief that they could not and would not betray the innocent. When the Gestapo arrived, they were met with something they hadn't expected: unity. The villagers stood together, resolute, refusing to give up the children. They shielded them with their own bodies, creating a wall of protection. Magda, at the forefront, remained calm and defiant. She had spent her entire life preparing for this moment, this stand for justice. The Gestapo, bewildered by the resistance they encountered, searched the village once again. They turned over homes, ransacked buildings, and interrogated villagers, but the children were hidden too well. Despite their best efforts, the Nazis found nothing. In that moment, Magda and the villagers of Le Chambon had won a small but profound victory. They had stood up to one of the most powerful and brutal regimes in history, not with violence, but with courage and conviction. And for those children, it meant everything. But the war was far from over. Magda knew that the Nazi threat loomed larger with each passing day. The Gestapo would not give up so easily. Still, she refused to back down. She continued to organize safe houses, to find ways to smuggle refugees across the border into Switzerland, and to rally her village behind the cause of compassion. As the war drew closer to its bloody conclusion, Le Chambon-sur-Lignon remained a sanctuary for hundreds of Jews, saved by the quiet bravery of Magda and those who stood by her side. They had risked everything, facing the terror of Nazi retaliation with nothing but their own humanity. And in the end, that humanity had prevailed. Magda Trocmé's legacy, like that of her village, would endure long after the war. Her courage, her unwavering dedication to the belief that every life is worth saving, would become a symbol of what is possible when ordinary people choose to do what is right, no matter the cost. For Magda, it had never been about heroism or recognition. It had always been about love. Love for her fellow human beings, love for justice, and love for the belief that in even the darkest of times, there is always hope. As the war dragged on, Magda Trocmé continued her work in the shadows, knowing that at any moment, everything could be taken from her and the village she had come to cherish. The villagers of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon had become a shining example of what it meant to resist tyranny, not through violence, but through compassion, unity, and unyielding courage. In the final months of the war, as Allied forces began to push back the Nazi regime, Magda and the villagers felt the first whispers of hope. News of liberation was on the horizon, but the dangers were not yet over. Even in the dying days of the war, the Nazis were desperate, lashing out in their last brutal acts of terror. Magda knew that while the end was in sight, the lives they had saved still hung in the balance. And then, finally, the war came to an end. France was liberated. The Nazi occupation crumbled, and with it, the terror that had gripped the lives of so many for years. For Magda Trocmé, the relief was overwhelming, but so too was the sorrow. She had seen so much suffering, so much loss. The faces of the children, the families, the refugees who had passed through her village remained etched in her memory, a constant reminder of the horrors they had survived. But there was also joy. Hundreds of lives had been saved because of her efforts, because of the bravery of a small village that had refused to turn away. And as the surviving Jewish families emerged from their hiding places, they embraced Magda and the villagers with tears of gratitude. They had been given a second chance at life because of this quiet, unassuming woman who had opened her heart and home to them. Magda never sought praise or recognition for what she had done. For her, the greatest reward was simply knowing that so many had been spared from the horrors of the Holocaust. Her work had been an act of love, and she had never wavered in her belief that the world could be a better place if only people were willing to take risks for one another. In the years that followed, the story of Magda Trocmé and the village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon would spread. They would be honored by Jewish organizations around the world, and in 1971, Magda and her husband André were recognized by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations for their extraordinary efforts to save Jewish lives during the Holocaust. But for Magda, the real heroes were the villagers, those ordinary men and women who had risked their own lives to save others. They had made a choice, not out of a desire for recognition, but because they believed in the power of doing what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it was dangerous. Magda Trocmé's legacy endures as a testament to the strength of the human spirit. Her story reminds us that in times of darkness, even the smallest acts of kindness can become acts of extraordinary courage. And while the world may remember her as a hero, Magda would simply say that she was doing what any person should, helping those in need, without hesitation, without fear. For the women of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, and for all those who stood with Magda, their quiet defiance had saved hundreds of lives. They had outsmarted the Nazis not with force, but with love. And in doing so, they had changed the course of history. The world was different now, scarred by war, but also filled with stories of hope, stories like Magda's that would inspire generations to come. And as the survivors of Le Chambon began to rebuild their lives, they carried with them the memory of a woman who had taught them that, in the face of hate, love is the most powerful weapon of all. Magda Trocmé passed away in 1996, but her spirit lives on in the lives of those she saved, and in the countless people who continue to be inspired by her remarkable courage and compassion. In the end, it wasn't just the war that Magda fought, it was the battle for humanity, for kindness, for love. And in that battle, she was victorious.